All right, we are 3 past the hour. It looks like we've just about reached critical mass, so we're going to get started. All right, morning all. I am Jim Rowland. I am the Planning Procurement Bureau Chief here at the IPA. I'm going to get us started here, but as you can see on the screen, we have a number of different agencies and consulting firms here for the IPA and ICC from E3, Energy, Environment, Economics, as well as Viridis. So if we could just click through to the next slide, this is the workshop on the load forecasting as well as ELCCs. There were materials if you haven't already gone out and looked and download them. If you go out to the IPA or the ICC websites, you should find an ability to both download today's presentation materials, and that's where in the future you'll also find other materials both for this workshop today as well as future materials. As we always do at the start of these workshops, let me click.
That we are all just silent and not that my audio is broken.
Yes, we can hear you, JC.
We can hear you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yep. Hold on one quick moment. All right. So as we always do at the kickoff of these workshops, we have the disclaimer. So please hold on as I get through this. These slides and their contents are intended for informational and discussion purposes only and do not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policy by the ICC, IPA, or its staff. Content presented, views, and opinions expressed during the webinar do not represent a legal interpretation, statement of policy, or statement of fact by the ICC, IPA, or its staff. The goal of these webinars is to inform and elicit participation from a variety of stakeholders. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Charlotte at E3 so that we...
Ancillary link.
Jim, we can hear you. You may want to,
chat.
Jim Z, we can hear you.
Agencies.
We may want to mute yourself.
Thanks.
Okay, yeah, one thing that I'll ask everyone right on the outset before I hand it off to Charlotte here is please mute yourself in all of the chats unless you're up to speak. I appreciate that. And with that, I'll hand it off to Charlotte at E3.
Rochelle, I don't think we can hear you, but we are starting with you. Give you one more second, then if not, I can just talk through these couple.
Yeah, we still can't hear you, Rochelle.
Okay, I'll walk through these couple slides and then hopefully we get your audio issues sorted by the end to facilitate Q&A. Hi, everybody. My name is Charlotte Fagan. I'm an associate director here at E3, based out of our Chicago office, and the project manager for the IRP and mitigation plans. So today, like in our other workshops, our meeting participation guides are to please, first and foremost, please include your organization name with your name on Zoom. So on those top 3 dots, you should be able to rename yourself. Please include your organization at the end of your name. If you're unable to do so, please just introduce yourself in the chat with your organization. It's helpful to understand who's in the room here today. We have set aside approximately an hour of time for Q&A at the end of this workshop, and so we certainly welcome your questions. You're invited to put questions into chat throughout the presentation if you'd like, or to hold those at the end where we will take a combination of questions in chat and live questions. When we arrive at that time, we will ask you to use the raise hand feature and to introduce yourself and the organization that you are representing before asking your question. Rochelle, once she gets her audio sorted, will facilitate our Q&A at the end. And we ask that you sort of ask one question at a time, since there will be, I imagine, a number of folks interested in asking their questions here. Of course, as always, please be respectful of other folks' viewpoints and perspectives, and to be concise with your questions, allow everyone to get a chance to ask their questions here. At the end of the slides, we will have a stakeholder feedback form. There's a QR code as well as a link in the documents that are posted on the website where we'll be soliciting your feedback on today's materials. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on both the ICC and IPA websites. So right now we're going through agenda and norms. Then I will walk us through load forecasts. Then I will hand it to my colleague Kevin, who will talk about our reliability methodology. And then I will hand it to my colleague Melissa to talk about our ELCC results and reliability benchmarking. And as I mentioned, we're trying to save an hour of time at the end for Q&A. And so welcome your questions at that time. So with that, I will hop into the content of today's workshop. So thank you all for spending your Friday morning on a summer Friday here with us. This is the fourth stakeholder workshop in the IRP and mitigation plan process. As Jim teed up, today we're going to be focused on two topics. Load scenarios that we're using in the IRP and the effective load carrying capability, or ELCC, results that we will also be using in the IRP. In September, we will hold the final public workshop for the IRP and present draft capacity expansion results at that time. I will note that the IRP is being completed under a compressed statutory schedule, which in turn requires a condensed stakeholder process. And so we recognize that we are moving very quickly from one analytical step to the next. And so we appreciate, stakeholders continuing to engage with this process under this timeline. All of this work is building towards the deadline to release the IRP report in November, on the November 16th. And the IRP and mitigation plan teams are also coordinating closely so that the assumptions, methods, and findings of the two studies remain coherent with one another. The mitigation plan draft is currently expected to be released in that early to mid-October timeframe, which allows the two analyses to remain in parallel with one another. So jumping into our first topic of the day with the load scenarios that we are studying. The IRP will evaluate 4 load scenarios that reflect uncertainty around 2 major drivers of electricity demand in Illinois: data center development and electrification. The statute requires the IRP to study at least 3 load scenarios that test a range of possible futures and associated resource needs. We are evaluating 4 cases here, because data center growth and economy-wide electrification create distinct planning questions, and we want the analysis to capture both. Each scenario has 4 components laid out on the right hand of this screen. First is the base load. This includes residential, commercial, and industrial end uses, apart from incremental data center and electrification loads that we model separately. Second is data center load. Third is transportation electrification, including EV adoption and charging behavior assumptions. And fourth is building electrification, primarily the adoption of electric heat pumps. The base case combines the base load forecast for existing end uses with a mid-data center scenario and lower transportation and building electrification assumptions. The low data center case combines that same base load with a low data center scenario and lower electrification assumptions. This is the low bookend of the IRP load range. The electrification cases use that same mid-data center scenario from the base case, but it pairs it with high levels of transportation and building electrification. This case aligns with the hybrid electrification pathway in the parallel decarbonization study that's being conducted under the Future of Natural Gas proceeding. The building electrification assumptions are labeled as medium-high because it assumes that there's high rates of and widespread heat pump deployment, but that it moderates the impact on winter peak demand because it assumes installed hybrid heating system that retain gas as a backup heat for the coldest conditions, which limits the impact on the winter peak demand. The backup heating is still served by a combination of natural gas with reduced upstream methane emissions and biomethane. And this is in line with the natural gas decarbonization goals outlined in the decarbonization study. The high data center case combines base load with a high data center scenario and lower electrification assumptions. It is designed to test a future with more sustained data center development. Taken together, the 4 cases provide a meaningful range of potential electricity demand futures. The low data center case provides the lower bookend, and the high data center case and the electrification case represent 2 different upper end futures, one driven primarily by large new loads, and the other with a broader fuel switching from transportation and buildings. So in this slide, we're trying to tee up a little bit this comparison of the load scenarios we were looking at in the IRP with the 2024 RA study. And you will see throughout these slides that we're often showing that comparison to try to be as transparent as possible about the ways in which these load scenarios have shifted and changed since last year's study. So at the statewide level, the 2026 IRP base case is similar in overall magnitude to the load projections used in the 2025 RA study. The most important change is where the projected data center load is located. Compared with the 2025 study, the base case scenario shifts some data center growth from ComEd's footprint and towards the LRZ4 footprint. As a result, the 2026 IRP base scenario reflects a lower data center trajectory in ComEd's territory and a higher trajectory in the LRZ4 territory as compared to the 2025 study. When the two areas are combined, total statewide load is slightly lower than, but broadly comparable to the scenario used in the RA study. The four load scenarios that we are studying here combine information from Ameren, ComEd, PJM, MISO, as well as independent research and analysis conducted by E3. For the base load component, we use the utility and RTO forecasts for residential, commercial, and industrial demand. We separate out data center load, electric vehicle load, and building electrification load and study those separately. For data center load, E3 developed low, mid, and high scenarios using information provided by the utilities, RTOs, as well as project-specific information on announced and developing facilities and independent third-party forecasts for Illinois and broader RTO regions. And I'll get into this a bit on the next couple of slides. For transportation and building electrification, the IRP draws from the work completed for the ICC's parallel decarbonization study, and this alignment ensures that the two studies use consistent assumptions when evaluating electrification and the resulting effects on electricity demand. So for us, the purpose here is to assemble using the available evidence that we have and compiling that into internally consistent planning cases that can test how the system performs across a range of futures. So first, I'm going to walk through how we address the data center, EV, and heating components of the forecast before looking at how those are compiled together into different scenarios. So we look at three different data center scenarios as part of the IRP. The data center scenarios vary primarily in two respects: the share and timing of proposed projects that are assumed to be completed, and the rate of additional growth after that current project development cycle is complete. And the data used to develop these assumptions were derived from utility forecasts, RTO forecasts, and additional data sets that include mapping data center development across RTOs. E3 used these different data sources to inform scenario assumptions around proposed projects and growth rates. The low case includes data centers that are already in service and facilities that are actively under construction. It assumes that projects under construction come online over the next 1 to 2 years, but does not assume that there are any additional proposed facilities beyond those already in service or under construction. It also assumes that those remain in operation, but that no more facilities are built after those in construction today. It creates some near-term growth in these scenarios, followed by a relatively flat trajectory. And so this serves as the floor for how we think about data center development in the IRP. The mid case here builds on that low case and informs what we are calling this moderated forecast. It assumes that facilities in service and under construction proceed, and that approximately half of proposed projects are completed. So it's assuming relatively strong growth during the next 7 years, and then a substantial slowdown after that. Sort of after that initial development period, the long-term growth rate moves towards the low single digits and becomes more consistent with broader economic. And so the mid case represents a moderated view of current development expectations. It recognizes that there is a significant near-term pipeline of projects while avoiding assuming that today's growth continues indefinitely. The high case assumes that a larger share of proposed projects are completed and that stronger data center growth continues for a longer period of time. This trajectory is more consistent with industry forecasts and estimates, and we use this to test the upper end of potential planning and reliability needs. I think when we think about these three cases together, we should view these as planning scenarios, not as specific forecasts of a particular future. The value of this range is that it allows the IRP to test how resource needs change under materially different levels and durations of data center. So on this slide, we're showing that low, mid, and high data center case that we are using in the IRP. I'll note here that this is also showing what the RA study in 2025 showed, as well as the utility forecast. So to develop and benchmark these cases, we use both bottom-up and top-down methods. Right? The bottom-up analysis considers announced and developing projects that can be associated with specific locations. And then the top-down analysis compares those resulting growth trajectories with utility, RTO, and industry forecasts. On both charts, the blue diamond you see represents announced facilities in the relevant area, and this just helps to contextualize the scale of the scenarios relative to announced projects. The prior RA study provides another reference point for how expectations have shifted, even just in 1 year. I'll note that blimp in the RA study line on the ComEd slide is a data translation issue, and that as reflected in the study, that line is a smooth increase and doesn't have that wrinkle in demand. So for ComEd, the chart compares the utility-based data center forecast with the IRP low, mid, high cases. The IRP cases span quite a wide range here because there's substantial uncertainty about which proposed projects will proceed, how quickly they will reach full load, and whether the current pace of development will persist. For MISO LRZ4, the chart similarly compares the IRP cases with Ameren's low, mid, and high forecasts in the prior RA study. The main takeaway here is that same geographic shift that I mentioned earlier. The IRP generally reflects less data center growth in ComEd than the 2025 study and more growth in LRZ4. The range remains broad in both areas, because the development pipeline and longer-term growth outlook remain uncertain. For transportation electrification and that component of the load scenarios, we have two cases here. We have our base case and the electrification case. The low case here is anchored to current adoption trends, while the electrification case looks at what adoption rates would need to be consistent with Illinois policy goals. So the base case extends historical adoption trends using county-level vehicle registration data published by the Illinois Secretary of State. And so this provides a grounded view based on the pace of adoption observed today. The electrification case assumes a faster transition, and it assumes that vehicles, EVs, reach 100% of light-duty sales by 2035, and zero-emission vehicles reach 100% of new, medium, and heavy-duty vehicle sales by 2040. As you can see, when we look at these two lines, the electrification case assumes a faster transition and produces a materially greater electric load from vehicle charging. So it allows the IRP to evaluate the resource and peak demand implications for transportation electrification at the scale that would be needed to support the state's long-term energy and emissions goal. We take a similar approach looking at building electrification, where we have a trend-based base case and a policy-aligned electrification case. So the base case uses the NREL Heat Pumps for All database to estimate the share of Illinois homes that could cost-effectively adopt a heat pump today. That near-term opportunity is concentrated in homes that currently use electric resistance heating or propane heating. The forecast adds about 30,000 heat pumps a year. We generally see that this opportunity is larger in LRZ4 than in ComEd's territory because there's a greater presence of electric resistance and propane heating in that area. Both the base case and the electrification case also include 1,000 ground source heat pumps per year beginning in 2028 to reflect the impact of the state's geothermal homes and business program. The electrification case examines the level of heat pump adoption needed to support economy-wide net zero decarbonization by 2050. It's aligned with a hybrid electrification pathway in the decarbonization study, as I mentioned earlier. Under that pathway, heat pumps are widely adopted, but homes retain backup heating for the coldest days of the year. In the decarbonization study, the gas system is transitioning to a decarbonized system by 2050. And so for the IRP, the important system planning feature is that backup heating reduces the amount of electric capacity needed to serve the most extreme winter conditions to heat homes. Okay, so now that I've walked through the component pieces, we're going to start to put them together and look at them in aggregate. So the 2026 IRP uses updated forecasts for the broader PJM and MISO regions, and these forecasts are slightly higher than what we saw in the 2025 RA study. So what we do in the IRP is that we vary load across these 4 IRP load scenarios that we are considering. But in every scenario that we look at, the PJM and MISO forecast outside of Illinois remains the same. We made this choice so that the scenario results isolate the effects of uncertainty within Illinois and does not sort of get caught up in noise about what is happening outside of Illinois. So here what we see is that on these charts, we're comparing to the prior RA forecast, the current RTO forecasts, and the forecast used in the 2026 IRP. The updated IRP forecast reflects the most current regional information available for this analysis while remaining consistent, while maintaining a consistent regional backdrop across the Illinois scenarios. I'll note that this chart, as well as the subsequent charts, extend these lines out to 2050. However, the IRP capacity expansion analysis itself only runs until 2047. And so we'll see this on all slides we're showing out to 2050, but the IRP, we will only be examining capacity expansion until 2047, in the 20-year period from 2027 to 2047. So when we disaggregate that PJM and MISO forecasts, data centers are the largest source of incremental load growth over the study period. The base load component remains the largest portion of total electricity demand, but it's not the component that is growing most quickly. The most visible increase over the next 2 decades comes from that data center development. You also see heating and transportation electrification contributing to that growth, but it is smaller than what we see in either the baseload or the data center portions. I'll note that this chart is looking at annual energy. And so we're going to walk through a few annual energy charts before then looking at peak demand. So this is looking at the base case of annual energy by component for PJM and LRZ4. So what we see here is that the Illinois scenarios broadly mirror the regional trends that we're seeing, that data centers are the largest driver of growth in the base case, and that electrification contributes a smaller amount under the lower electrification assumptions in the base case scenario. So here we see all 4 load scenarios that we are considering for ComEd, as well as the 2025 RA study. These 4 scenarios represent, again, a wide range of plausible electricity demand futures for Northern Illinois. The updated scenarios are generally lower than the 2025 RA study, primarily because of this updated information on planned data center development, and because now the IRP evaluates several data center futures instead of just one single trajectory. The cases begin to separate sort of more noticeably after 2035. And what we're seeing is then that low data center case growth is pretty limited because that scenario is just the facilities that are online or in construction. That base case, which has that mid data center assumptions, produces more near-term growth, but then sort of flattens out after 2035, 2037. And you see in that high data center case that it grows more quickly because it assumes a larger portion of projects are completed and has a slightly higher growth rate over time. The electrification case follows a different pattern. Because that case is driven by vehicle and building stock turnover, it is sort of more gradual, and we'll see the same thing when we look at the LRZ4 scenario as well. So By around 2035, the electrification case becomes the high bookend case for the load scenario for ComEd's territory. So now looking at LRZ4, again, these scenarios show a pretty broad range between the 4 scenarios. Unlike in the ComEd territory, the updated scenarios are generally higher than the load forecast used in the 2025 resource adequacy study. This reflects updated information indicating more data center development in the Ameren area, and the high data center case here is the highest annual energy case throughout most of the study period because of that rapid early build out of proposed projects. Later in the horizon, the electrification case catches up and ultimately becomes the highest case as EV and heating equipment continue to turn over. The base case sits between those upper cases and the lower bookend as data center growth slows after that initial development period. Okay, so now we're going to switch from looking at this on an annual energy basis to a peak basis. So on these slides, what you're seeing is the solid lines are the peak for the 2026 IRP, and the dotted lines are to reference this to the 2025 RA study looking at summer peak and winter peaks. So, of course, peak demand is distinct from annual energy. Annual energy means total electricity consumption over a year, while peak demand measures the highest level of demand that the system must be prepared to serve during a limited number of hours. Capacity and reliability needs are therefore highly sensitive to the peak forecast and to whether the system peaks in summer or winter. So for ComEd, again, we're seeing that the updated IRP forecast is slightly lower than the 2025 study. In PJM as a whole, the updated peak is higher than the 2025 study. In LRZ4, the peak forecast is somewhat higher than the prior study, but you can see it's very close. And we are seeing that in MISO North, the updated summer peak is similar to the prior study, and the winter peak is somewhat lower. Okay, and this will be my last slide on loads before I hand it to my colleague Kevin. So here we're looking at our 4 different load scenarios and their peak demand. So for ComEd, the base case begins at about 22 gigawatts in 2027 and grows to approximately 28 gigawatts by 2047. The low data center case grows more modestly from 22 gigawatts to 24 gigawatts. In both the low data center case and the base case, peak growth slows after 2035, reflecting this assumption that the rapid data center development period does not continue indefinitely. The base case still includes continued growth after 2035, but at a more moderate pace. The high data center case shows a steeper increase between 2027 and 2035 because it assumes a larger portion of projects are completed, and growth continues after 2035, but at a slower rate. The electrification case grows more consistently from 2027 to 2047, and that pattern reflects the gradual turnover of vehicles and building and heating equipment rather than the concentrated wave of large project additions. For Ameren and LRZ4, the base case starts at approximately 9 gigawatts in 2027 and grows to approximately 14 gigawatts by 2047. As in ComEd, growth slows after 2035 as that data center trajectory moderates. The low case begins at about 9 gigawatts, rises to 10, and then returns back to 9 gigawatts by 2047. What we see there is that those small amounts of data center growth is sort of offset by energy efficiency and other factors associated with the base load in that low case. The high data center case grows from approximately 9 gigawatts in 2027 to 15 gigawatts by 2035, and then reaches about 17 gigawatts by 2047. That steep early increase reflects that higher assumed completion of projects, followed by a slower pace of growth on that later in the horizon. The electrification case also reaches about 17 gigawatts by 2047, but again, that path is steadier, driven by stock turnover. So here, as I wrap up, the principal takeaway here is that different sources of load growth create different timing patterns, and that studying a wide range of potential futures is really important to make sure that we are capturing some of the uncertainty around different drivers of load growth. And the capacity expansion analysis will test how the system responds to each one of these load scenarios. And so with that, I will pass it to Kevin to talk through the next portion of the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Charlotte. And before I dive into this section, I would just note, we are seeing a lot of comments and questions come through in the chat. We definitely appreciate everyone's participation there. We do have about an hour held for Q&A after this section, so we're planning to cover those questions then through moderated Q&A. But we appreciate everyone's feedback and encourage folks to keep posting questions in the chat, and we'll balance responses to those with verbal questions as well during the Q&A section. So with that administrative note aside, I want to kick off this discussion by providing an overview or a refresher on our planning framework and how our reliability model fits into that framework. So during the first half of today's meeting, Charlotte focused on a walkthrough of our load scenarios as a key input into our modeling framework. And in the subsequent slides in this section, we'll discuss our reliability model in more detail. So I'll walk through our methodology and benchmarking, and then our technical lead, Melissa Rodas, will walk through our ELCC results under our base case scenarios. But taking a step back, two key models underpin the planning framework that's being leveraged for the IRP: a capacity expansion model or portfolio model, which selects a portfolio of generation and transmission investments subject to a set of policy and reliability constraints. And that model is coupled with a reliability model to validate that the cost-effective portfolios that are selected meet resource adequacy standards. For our capacity expansion model, we're using Plexos, which is the same modeling framework used by MISO and PJM. And our reliability model leverages RECAP, which is E3's in-house resource adequacy modeling framework that we've utilized in many state and utility planning processes across the country. The focus of the next several slides will be on our RECAP methodology and some initial results. And so we use RECAP to examine the contributions of each resource towards system reliability needs. And we do that by running hundreds of simulations across many different combinations of load and weather conditions. Those resource adequacy contributions of each resource, or those ELCC values, are then input into the Plexos model, which needs to meet a reliability constraint as part of its optimization, and we'll choose a cost-effective portfolio of resources whose reliability contributions add up to that resource adequacy standard in each area. Additionally, once the portfolios are built, we do use RECAP to stress test them over a wide range of weather years, again, to ensure that the cost-effective portfolios selected by the capacity expansion framework are robust and reliable across a wide range of conditions. So these models in tandem ensure that the portfolios selected and examined as part of the IRP process are cost optimal, policy compliant, and reliable over a broad range of weather conditions under each scenario's inputs and assumptions. So if we dive into the underlying methodology of our reliability model, RECAP is a loss of load probability model that simulates resource adequacy risks under a broad range of conditions. And more specifically, RECAP simulates the hourly operations of the system over the course of the entire year for a range of different weather years. And then we perform Monte Carlo draws that represent random outage risks, as well as other probabilistic conditions, including the relationship between weather and temperature and renewable output. And if we jump to the next slide, this framework in RECAP provides us with a detailed picture of the resource adequacy challenges facing the system over each season and hour of the year. So if we jump to the next slide, we have that illustrated in more detail. So we use RECAP to create a distribution of system loss of load risks, including frequency, duration, and magnitude of those potential risks. And then we simulate the change in system risks as resources are incrementally added to the system. And that provides us with the resource accreditation or ELCC of each resource. And Melissa will walk through an illustration of the ELCCs and some of our initial results in subsequent slides. If we move to the next slide, for this study and for the IRP broadly, we actually have 4 different reliability models set up. So we have one reliability model for each RTO to assess region-wide risks and the corresponding reliability contributions of different resources towards those system-wide risks. And then we also have a reliability model developed for each zone within Illinois to perform that same evaluation of risks and reliability contributions within the ComEd and LRZ4 zones. We, in these models, simulate 35 weather years across the 1990 to 2024 historical record. And then we perform 20 Monte Carlo draws. And so we effectively simulate the operations of the system across an entire year 700 times. And this allows us to capture not only a broad range of weather conditions across that 35-year historical record, but again, the risks associated with generator performance during those conditions. So the relationship between load and renewable output, for example, the probability of having high solar output on a hot day with high cooling load, as well as thermal generator risks associated with potential outages driven by extreme weather. Diving into the how we model the performance of each resource in more detail, we capture the relationship between temperature and generator availability. So for thermal generators, we develop a correlation between outage risk and weather based on their historical performance during challenging weather conditions, such as periods of extreme heat or extreme cold. For renewable generators, we perform a simulation of renewable output during a subset of weather years in that historical record. And then we develop a probabilistic relationship between temperature and output. So again, during a hot summer day, the range of potential solar output is likely pretty narrow, as it's likely to be fairly sunny day, whereas the range of potential wind output might be wider. And similarly, the inverse might be true on a winter day, which are typically periods of high wind output, but can be a broad range of solar output. And then lastly, for duration-limited resources, we are performing a chronological simulation of hourly risks. And so we do capture the performance characteristics of storage and demand response resources and their ability to respond to reliability challenges over sustained periods. Then the last step in our modeling methodology is to benchmark our modeling framework to the RTOs using their publications of current system dynamics. And so when we simulate the dynamics of the PJM system today, we reach a similar seasonal and hourly distribution of risk as PJM has published. And more specifically, we find that peak demand windows during the summer drive resource adequacy risks during late afternoons and evenings, while outage risks for thermal generators in the winter also lead to reliability challenges and risks in the winter mornings and evenings, which also coincide with times of highest heating demand, even though winter peaks are not as high as summer peaks on today's system. And then if we turn to MISO on the next slide, we generally see more concentration of risk in the summer with a small share of winter risk, again, driven in part by that thermal outage risk. and this allocation of risks across seasons is generally consistent with the dynamics that MISO finds in its own modeling. So these well-benchmarked models accomplish two things. The first is that they allow us to now turn to analyzing the reliability contributions of resources on today's system and in the near to medium term. And the second is that they also serve as the foundation for analyzing how the reliability contributions of each resource evolves over time and under different scenarios. And so, in other words, while the focus of today's presentation and the focus of the results on the next few slides will be on reliability contributions for the 2030 system, the overarching objective of this modeling framework is to analyze how reliability risks and resource contributions to those risks change under our IRP scenarios over time, which then serve as an input into our portfolio modeling. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Melissa to walk through the ELCC results for today's system.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So now that we've determined alignment with RTO system dynamics, we want to use our models to create the key outputs that we need for our long-term capacity expansion modeling. One of those reliability outputs is effective load carrying capacity, or ELCCs, which measure how much a resource contributes to reliability. We calculate ELCCs in this IRP in 3 steps. The first step is to calibrate the existing system to a reliability target. We do this by modeling the existing system, calculating its achieved reliability, and then adding or removing generation in every hour or perfect capacity until we hit a 0.1 LOLE target. Then we add the resource or resources that we want to evaluate and calculate what the new reliability is after that addition. In the third step, we remove perfect capacity until the system is back at the reliability target, or the same reliability as in step 1. The ELCC is the measure of how much perfect capacity the new resource can replace while keeping the reliability the same. Not every resource is valued the same, and even the same resources that are added can have different values based on the underlying system dynamics. Then we can skip to the next slide. So ELCCs are not static. They change with the underlying portfolio because resources have interactive effects with each other. Resources can have complementary effects, which is what we call a diversity benefit. One of the key examples of this is solar and storage, where their operations often complement each other. So this illustration shows what that dynamic can look like. This is an illustrative figure that is not from any modeling results from Illinois, but just shown to demonstrate this impact. So the graph on the left shows what an example peak day looks like with new solar resources. The darkest shading represents the first addition of the resource, and the lightest represents the last addition, while the dotted line represents the new net peak after each addition of the resource. We can see that the first addition of solar dramatically decreases the peak of the system and reduces system risk. However, by the time you get to the last tranche of solar added, it's no longer reducing the peak, since the net peak has moved until after the solar generation period has ended. The cumulative ELCC of these 3 tranches of solar is 5.2 gigawatts. Similarly, in the storage figure, we can see that the first tranche of 4-hour storage can meaningfully reduce the peak. But by the time you're at the last tranche of storage, the new net peak is spanning much longer than the 4-hour duration of the battery, which limits storage's contribution to reducing system risk. The cumulative ELCC of these 3 tranches of storage is 8.3 gigawatts. The last graph shows solar and storage dispatching together, and we can see how these resources perform when they're combined. The solar resources meet load during the daytime hours and push the net peak into the early evening. Storage is now better equipped to meet this new shorter net peak across all of its tranches. Solar and storage together have a combined ELCC of 5.2 gigawatts, which is more than the 13.5 gigawatts that they would get by just adding each of their individual ELCCs together. The additional 1.7 gigawatt of ELCC represents the diversity benefit that these resources get from being installed together. And we kept this dynamic in mind, and we designed our ELCC framework to capture these interactive effects between resource types. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so E3 calculated ELCCs for all resource types that are modeled in Plexos. But today we're going to focus on results for wind, solar, and 4-hour storage. E3 used ELCC curves for the long-term capacity expansion modeling. Curves must be extensive to capture a range of potential builds over the modeling horizon, and that reflect the cumulative value of all currently installed resources. We're about to show ELCC curves for all 4 regions we studied, so I want to walk through how to interpret these graphs. So the cumulative graph on the left represents the ELCC megawatt that the installed amount of a resource can provide to the system. Here we can see that the first 2,500 megawatts of installed solar provide 1,387 megawatts of ELCC, or 55% RA value per megawatt. Each addition of the resource provides more value. However, as more solar is installed, subsequent megawatts receive less value relative to their installed capacity. The graph on the right shows the incremental solar ELCCs. We calculate this by subtracting the ELCC at one point from the point before it relative to the difference in installed capacity. We can think of this as the slope of the cumulative graph. What this shows is that while our first tranche of solar is getting 55% of its value in ELCC, the second tranche is only getting 15%. And new solar resources in ComEd would only get 4% of their incremental installed capacity in ELCC. So the solar ELCCs have high initial value, but quickly experience diminishing returns. Then we can go to the next slide. So now that we know how to read these slides, we can see the results across solar, wind, and storage in ComEd. So we ran ELCCs through 75 gigawatts of each resource type to give Plexos a large range of capacities. But the 2030 ComEd peak is forecasted to be around 25 gigawatts in the base case. So the key portion of this curve to focus on is the earlier part. So for wind, ELCCs are starting out at 15%, and diminish to single-digit ELCCs. And a key thing to note here is that wind ELCCs are lower than solar, especially in initial tranches, because ComEd has summer peaking load. So solar can perform better at meeting summer peak load conditions. At 10% of the system peak, ELCC for wind is 15%. And once installed capacity reaches the forecasted peak, wind ELCCs are around 2%. This is the same solar figure that we had seen on the previous slide, where we see solar ELCC starting at 55% and diminishing to 1% once solar penetrations reach the forecasted peak. At 10% of peak, the ELCC is 55%. ComEd has minimal amounts of installed storage capacity online today, so new tranches of storage would get 95% ELCC. At 10% of peak, the storage ELCC is 90%, and their ELCC diminishes as well. At the forecasted peak, ELCC would be around 10%. These storage ELCCs also take into account the diversity benefits that storage would get from being installed with other renewable resources. And we can go to the next slide. Great. Similarly, in LRZ4, we ran ELCCs through 75 gigawatts of each resource. But the 2030 LRZ4 peak is forecasted to be around 11 gigawatts in the base case, so very early into this curve. Also notice the change in y-axis. LRZ4 is a smaller system than ComEd, so resources are generally getting less ELCC on a megawatt basis. Wind ELCCs are starting at 10% in initial tranches and diminish into single digits. When installed capacity reaches the forecasted peak, wind ELCCs are around 2%. Solar ELCCs also start high at 43%, but diminish to 1% once the capacity reaches the forecasted peak. Similar to ComEd, LRZ4 has minimal amounts of installed storage capacity online today, so new storage additions get a high ELCC. At 10% of the peak, the ELCC is 94%. Their ELCC also diminishes at higher penetrations, and ELCC would be around 10% once penetrations reach the forecasted peak. These ELCCs were calculated for a near-term year in 2 regions with similar summer peaking loads. These similar dynamics lead to similar ELCC dynamics across both LRZ4 and ComEd. We can go to the next slide. Cool. And then also we understand that there's RA risk forecasted across the RTOs, and Plexus will be building resources RTO-wide to meet the region's reliability needs. So we also calculated ELCCs for the rest of the regions. Here are the ELCCs for the rest of PJM, which is PJM excluding ComEd. To orient us here, the 2030 rest of PJM forecasted peak is around 165 gigawatts. So the wind ELCCs here are starting at 18% with initial tranches and steadily decreasing at higher penetrations. At 10% of PJM's peak, wind is getting a 15% ELCC. Incremental ELCCs are also staying higher relative to ComEd because of the larger system size. For solar, the ELCCs are starting at 59%, and much of this high ELCC is captured within the existing capacity, so new incremental additions get much smaller ELCCs. At 10% of PJM's peak, solar is getting a 35% ELCC. PJM also has small amounts of installed storage capacity online today, so new tranches of storage are getting a high ELCC. But at 10% of PJM's peak, storage is getting an ELCC of around 55%. We can go to the next slide. So similarly to PJM, Plexus is also building resources to meet demand in the rest of LRZs 1 through 7. So we calculated ELCCs for the rest of LRZs 1 through 7, or LRZs 1, 2, 3, and 5, 6, and 7. The forecasted peak in rest of LRZs 1 through 7 is 105 gigawatts, so smaller than PJM, but still significantly larger than LRZ4 and ComEd. LRZs 1 through 7 already have significant amounts of wind installed in the system, and at 10% of system peak, wind ELCC is roughly 20%. Solar is getting a 60% ELCC when it's at 10% of the peak, and LRZs 1 through 7 also have significant amounts of solar installed, and at 10% of system peak, storage ELCC is around 90% in LRZs 1 through 7. In all 4 of these zones, ELCCs are following a similar trend where value diminishes at higher capacities. The resource values saturate at different rates depending on the technology type and the underlying regional dynamics. Now I'm going to pass it back over to Kevin.
Great. Thanks so much, Melissa. And I'll now transition to talking about next steps. We started today's workshop by talking through our load scenario development and then walked through the development and initial results from our reliability modeling framework. With each of those analytical steps completed, we'll now turn our attention to developing distinct sets of ELCCs for each of our 4 load scenarios that we've walked through today. And then using these load scenarios and inputs, as well as corresponding ELCC results for each load scenario as inputs into the IRP portfolio modeling. So I'll now hand the mic back to Charlotte to wrap up this section of the meeting, and we'll quickly transition to Q&A.
Thanks, Kevin. Rochelle, are you back here? And
you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry about that earlier. Thank you.
Oh, all good. Okay, hand it over to you for Q&A.
Sounds good. Thanks, Charlotte. All right, so we are going to take some live questions. We'll get to Q&A in just a second. We'll take some live questions, integrate some chat questions in there as well. We did see a bunch of questions in the chat, so we'll answer some of those during this Q&A, and then we'll switch back to live questions. But before we do that, we do have the option for you to submit comments similar to our other workshops. And so there is a form that you can fill out for the comment form. The link is in the materials. So you can fill that out after this session is completed. So you wouldn't be able to access it now, but as soon as this session is completed, the form will be live. So you can either access it via the link on the page or the QR code. And we're allowing 15 days for comments. So just please have your comments submitted by August 14th. And then we do ask that all comments are submitted via the comment form. But if you do have additional comments or anything that you like, additional attachments or anything else, those can be sent to me, and my email address is on the screen. And then we just ask that you include in your subject line IRP stakeholder comments workshop 4, so I know exactly which ones to attribute those comments to. And then last but not least, we just ask that if you do send us any attachments or any other documentation, that they meet the accessibility requirements for the IPA and ICC, and then that link to the accessibility requirements is on the page as well. And with that, we'll jump into Q&A. We'll take some live questions first, so please use the raise hand feature so we know who wants to ask a question live. We'll do a few live questions, and then we'll transition to the chat questions, and then transition back to live questions after that as well, and we'll just bounce back and forth. So any live questions, go ahead and use the raise hand feature. Perfect, we got a couple. All right, Scott Dunbar, Joint Solar Parties, go ahead.
Hi there, thanks folks, thanks for the great presentation. I have heard and read recently about how models like Plexos and like Encompass, by relying on representative days of the season or representative days of the month, can significantly underestimate the value of storage resources. They basically, because they use these representative days, they don't see the intraday and rapid response capabilities of storage resources. I actually heard a expert from Brattle at a recent IRP hearing compare it to underestimating someone who's doing day trading of stocks, that if you look at the long-term performance of stocks, you'd think that day trading was a worthless activity, but if you look at the daily fluctuation of stocks, you could see that there's an ability to capture value, and he analogized that to storage ability to respond to intraday fluctuations. So I wondered if that's something E3 has thought about, and if that's accounted for in Plexos in any way or in your modeling. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. I can take the first pass at that. I think in part that's the objective of leveraging our reliability framework and our capacity expansion framework in tandem, is that our reliability framework does simulate hourly operations across the entire year to capture the resource adequacy value and some of that intraday value that battery storage can provide, while the representative day features in Plexos allow us to capture the inter-day energy value that storage provides. Generally, I think a lot of for short duration resources, a lot of that value will be captured within the day, but we do use our reliability framework in tandem with the capacity expansion framework, in part to address those types of questions and to explicitly capture the resource adequacy value of storage in a comprehensive way.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, we have 2 more hands raised, and then we will move on to chat questions, and then we'll go back to live questions. So just, I know that most of you know this, but if you just have, we just ask that you ask one question, then if you have another question, just go ahead and raise your hand again, and then we can get you on the next one just to make sure we have time for everybody's questions. So Scott from Illinois OAG.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Scott Metzger from the Office of the Attorney General. I've only got one, but try to use it wisely. I guess, can you talk a little bit more about the increase in the data center forecast for MISO Zone 4? I know you outlined the types of sources you looked at, but it seems like a pretty big, like a pretty stark jump, and I was just wondering if if there's more specificity about where that comes from. I'd be interested, or if it could be posted, I'd be interested in seeing it.
Sure. So, I think what we're seeing, as I described, is that we're doing both a kind of bottom-up view and a top-down view. Some of the bottom-up sources that we're looking at are tracking, geospatially looking at where projects are breaking ground. What we're seeing is that there is increased activity in LRZ4 and in MISO broadly. But we're also then looking at the kind of top-down view of what some of these longer-term growth rates look like. And so what we are seeing is, when we look at that data and sort of different sources that forecast growth in both PJM and in MISO, what we are seeing is what looks like maybe a potentially higher growth in MISO and in LRC4. But because we know that there is significant uncertainty about that development, that is why we have such a broad range of estimates, right? We have a low case that says only what is in operation or under construction as sort of the low bookend, and then something that is more kind of aligned to industry forecasts of a high growth and sort of more sustained growth on the high side. And so I think the range we see here is probably what is the range of cases that we are looking at, I think, is what is really important here, as opposed to like fixating too much on what the specific forecast of any one. The key here is that there's uncertainty, and therefore it's important to look at the broad range of potential futures.
Understood. It's just like the increase in sort of the base case assumption is, it seems like there was something more than a range of uncertainty that prompted that, kind of that change in where I think I understand some of the factors that would have made the ComEd zone go down, but the fact that the Zone 4 jumped up so high, it just looked pretty substantial. So I wanted to understand that. Thank you.
Yeah, I can just briefly comment on that. Reminder, Nate Miller, been supporting this, a project lead for this IRP along with Charlotte and Kevin. So part of that is that a more granular database of announced and in development projects was used to inform the data center load projections for the Illinois zones here relative to the RA study, where we just used the utility provided forecasts in isolation as data points. And so that analysis of the in development projects, announced projects, there are a lot of very large projects that have been announced in Illinois, in Southern Illinois specifically. And that is something that is like a newer and developing data point relative to data from the last 18 months. Now, obviously, all of this, as Charlotte was saying, is in great flux. There's a lot of announcements. We're not saying that, the base case means this is exactly what's going to happen, because there is a wide band of uncertainty here. But it's more that the change in expectations of a lot more announced activity of data centers in Southern Illinois, the Ameren zone, is what informed this elevation of the midpoint of the range for Southern Illinois.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Scott. All right, we'll take one more live question, then go to some chat questions, and then Raj will get to your question after a couple of chat questions. So Alex from Stack Energy Consulting, go ahead.
Great. Thank you. This is Alex Worsley with Stack Energy Consulting. Thank you for the presentation. My question, I think, is on slide maybe 34, and I'm wondering if you could help me understand a little bit better what I assume has to be a feedback loop between the portfolio model and the reliability model here. I think you guys nicely pointed out on slide 28 8 that there's a interaction between the resource mix that you're assuming and the ELCC values. And I think you could also say that the load profile would also impact the ELCC values. So they're not the ELCC values in the future, not just a function of the penetration of a specific resource type, which I think is what you're showing on slides 30 through 33 or 34. So I'm curious if you guys could help me understand a little bit better how you guys are thinking about ELCCs over time and how that interacts with your portfolio model and the interaction between those two.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there are a few questions in the chat along similar lines. Our ELCCs that we've shown in this presentation are focused on the near-term system and 2030 in particular. But we will have different ELCC curves for each of the 4 load scenarios that we're modeling and over the longer time frame. So we'll have ELCCs that reflect the characteristics of loads in the 2045 timeframe and reflect that shift, for example, in higher electrification scenarios, that shift in reliability risks towards winter morning and evening hours when heating load is the highest. So that will be reflected and that will in turn affect the reliability contributions of different resources. We also do capture within our ELCC curves the diversity effects between resources. And so there is, to your question, some iteration between the portfolio model and the reliability model, such that when we're modeling the ELCC curve for storage in the longer term, we are directly taking into account how much solar and wind we project to be on the system and capturing the diversity benefits of renewables and storage within our characterization of storage ELCCs in the long term. So there is that iteration of running the portfolio model, getting a sense of how much solar and wind we expect to be built, and then running our reliability model again with that level of solar and wind on the system when we're characterizing the reliability value of storage.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, we'll transition to a couple chat questions and then we'll go back to the live questions and then revert back to chat questions as well. So we'll start from the very beginning from the first question from Robert Stevens. First question, does draft capacity expansion results essentially mean draft IRP report? Those refer to the modeling results of resource portfolios selected by the Plexos model by scenario. Those will be model results, not a full draft IRP. And then the other question that you had alongside with that, Robert, the scenarios workshop proposed 3 load forecasts. Slide 6 of the load forecast ELCC deck now identifies 4 load forecast scenarios. And then Robert, you were asking for a revised scenario matrix showing exactly which load forecast is assigned to each modeled policy and technology case. The electrification case is essentially replacing the high load case, which previously included both the high electrification loads and high data center loads. But that updated electrification case has the same data center load as the base case so that the incremental needs for electrification relative to the base case can be more directly compared. And then E3 team, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that.
No, I think that covers it well, Rachel.
Perfect. Thanks, Nate. All right. Next question was from Jessica Collingsworth at NexAmp. These are in relation to slides 6 and 7. So slide 6, Jessica's asking how is data center load being estimated? Slide 7 says multiple load scenarios for the IRP were created using data provided by Ameren and ComEd, as well as independent research and analysis from E3. Is it both the existing operating load and the pipeline of requested interconnections? And also was PJM's ComEd zone forecast and MISO's long-term load forecast used? The answer to that is a combination of the bottom-up analysis of data center projects in development compared, and then we crosswalked those with total data center load forecasts by year that were provided by ComEd and Ameren. So PJM's and MISO's forecasts were used as reference points for us for data center loads outside of Illinois. But these load forecasts were also informed by the bottom-up analysis of data center projects that are currently in development. All right, we'll do one last question in the chat and then we'll get to the live questions again. So this one's from Chelsea from Energy Futures Group. This is also questions on slide 7. Slide 7 is the difference in the data center forecast, the result of updating assumptions from what E3 used to develop the 2025 RA study forecast, or did E3 use different sources to develop this IRP data center forecast? And then also to that is the difference in the 2025 RA study and 2026 IRP forecast for Ameren, the result of new prospective data center projects that were not evaluated or not known for the 2025 RA study or something else. So the Illinois zone loads that we have in the RA study from 2025 were derived directly from the load forecasts that were provided by Common and Ameren. But the IRP load forecasts also reference some updated load forecasts from the utilities, but the electrification and the data center components of the Illinois load were also derived from that bottom-up analysis that we mentioned before of announced data center projects and for electrification loads from current trends in sales of EVs and heat pumps, such as the base case, and then high trajectories required to meet state policy targets from the new decarbonization pathways work being performed by E3 and the ICC. Perfect. All right. So we went through a couple chat questions. We'll revert back to the live questions, and then we'll go back to chat as well. So Raj from Sue Green, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My question is specifically about the downward revision in the load forecast for ComEd between the 2025 RA and the 2026 IRP. Exelon in their Q2 2026 earnings had 9 gigawatts of high probability ComEd load forecast. And if you apply E3's 95% load factor, that's about 75 terawatt hours a year, which is more in line with the 2025 RA and about 2 times your 2026 IRP estimate for ComEd load. How do you reconcile that 95% load factor assumption with this new ComEd load factor projection?
Yeah, it's a great question, Raj. It's not so much a reconciliation of a difference in load factor assumptions. It's about the difference in sort of nameplate and peak megawatts from data center load. So it's a downward revision to the entire data center load in aggregate, not a change in load factor. So, there are a lot of utility-driven forecasts out there and announcements of we have this much in development, this much in development. There's a wide range of space. We took ComEd's, updated load forecast, which looked very similar to the 2025 forecast that they gave to us that we used in the RA study. So they've been very consistent in their announced view. But when we tried to, also contextualize that with a bunch of other data points, we found, not as much observed data from a bottoms-up perspective that supported that same view in the same range as we did in Southern Illinois. So, we had to create a range of scenarios. We're looking at a range of outcomes here. And so that was a difference in an allocation of where the data center projects have been announced between Northern and Southern Illinois that informed our adjustment to the relative split of data center load within Illinois. So certainly ComEd maybe does have exactly, have 1-for-1 every megawatt in that nameplate capacity forecast of theirs. We used that forecast along with Ameren's, just apples to apples in the last RA study, and we took a more, broad-reaching approach to look at other independent verification data points, and we used those points to also contextualize the range of load forecasts that went into the IRP.
Nate, if I can follow up with one question on this, what you specifically mentioned about the Southern Illinois, the new announcements. Industry projections have specific requirements for both load and bandwidth requirements for siting data centers. And in machine learning, as we go from training to inference, those requirements are quite different. Did E3 take those industry guidance on siting requirements while putting weightage on the Southern Illinois data center announcement versus the ComEd data center announcements?
Yeah, we've taken into account the best information that we had access to. There is a wide range of possibilities, of course, in this space. I also do not think anyone can point to, a specific region of data center load forecasts and know for certain how those facilities will operate, even what their TUE will look like over time. There's a lot of inference versus training. The reality is we're putting chipsets in buildings and the buildings are powered, right? And the other reality is those chipsets are very, very expensive, which means to recover the capital investment cost, they have to run at a very high load factor. Otherwise, it's wasted money, right? And so from that perspective alone, like we don't know exactly where Google or Meta or others will send compute across their data center fleets. But what we do know is that the price paid per unit of compute is very high and requires a very high load utilization factor to recover those investments. And so again, we've used the best data available from existing operating data centers in PJM and MISO and what their load factors look like, benchmarking that to what load factors of data centers have been around the country, and that has informed the load profile that we assign for the nameplate megawatts that are planned, in each of these different scenarios. So, the short version is we're tracking all those same trends, but I do not think that there is enough definitive data to say, yes, therefore, this degree of building efficiency in this zone for inference versus training will lead to this kind of a change in consumption pattern. We do not see enough very specific and granular justification to make those kinds of pronouncements beyond the aggregate load profiles that we can observe at a higher level across markets.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Raj. All right, we have two more hands raised, and then we'll go on to chat questions. So we'll get to Matthew. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the presentation this morning. A really good job. I think a degree of clarity on a lot of these issues. So I appreciate that. Just a couple, one comment, a question to follow with that, which is, discussing the zone for growth in data center load, large load that you're seeing, and the changes between the prior study, the resource adequacy study, and what you're working on with respect to this IRP. I have to acknowledge that doesn't surprise me, given we are seeing additional and hearing about additional data centers in the MISO region generally. And I also note, of course, that Ameren, Illinois is not the only retail supplier of electricity, at least delivery service company and supplier of electricity downstate, as we have a considerable amount of co-ops in municipalities as well. The question about that is, have you examined the impacts on potentially the local clearing requirements for Zone 4? And have you looked at that? Are you planning to do so and that be factored into your analysis?
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe just a couple of quick points to acknowledge there. So number one is that the IRP and mitigation plan modeling exercises are intended to model the state of Illinois as a whole. We've split the state into the two principal market zones in each RTO of ComEd and Ameren Zone 4, but those zones are inclusive, as you note, of a wide range of customers that are in those transmission zones. And so our load forecasts are intended to encompass that entire range of customers that exist in those transmission regions that have been defined for the model. So in other words, not just Ameren served customers, but other customers from munis co-ops in Southern Illinois as well are part of that aggregate. So that's one thing, just for total clarity. Secondly, as we think about the various constraints and requirements for individual data center facilities, both on the, call it, local level of, permitting, water usage, land, that kind of thing, as well as a higher, electric supply system requirement. Different portions of those may be very binding to certain facilities in certain areas. But at some point, similar to the question around data center load flexibility, any kind of assumptions on that side that would already kind of pre-limit what load is being added or how that load is being served. So if you were to say, hey, this much of data center load is going to be served off grid by itself, then you wouldn't include that load to begin with, right, in the planning exercise. The idea of the planning exercise is to say, if in a range of plausible futures from the best data that we have, and this is a fast moving target and a fast moving time, right? We all live in interesting times. What is, if, this range of load that has to be met, what are different portfolios that could meet it to give us a good kind of walking path that says, well, what's common across these various outcomes? And then what's common and then what's differentiated can inform state decision making, right? So in other words, we don't want to like assume data centers, for example, are very flexible when we don't know for certain that they're flexible, because then the model result that we're going to get is going to be very different. We want to say if this looks what we, this much load comes in and it must be served, what kind of resource mix is required to serve it? And then from there, that helps to, have a clearer, call it narrative and cause and effect analysis to inform the downstream decision making. Remember, each one of these portfolios by itself is not the future. This is a planning exercise to say, if this, then this, if this, then this, if this, then this. And then we look at the whole picture all together, right, alongside the ICC, the IPA, the agencies, and say, what should that mean? What does that mean for Illinois?
Yeah, I appreciate that's a good response. And one follow-up question, probably more rhetorical than anything for you guys to consider, is just acknowledging that downstate zone 4 is fairly import dependent today. We did have a MaxGen event, right? We were importing considerable amounts of electricity from other regions and predominantly PJM. That's been a state of being for some time. Are you going to, I guess the question would be, are you going to be continuing to look at the interdependencies that you see in the power flows between PJM, ComEd zone, and zone 4, incorporating that into your analysis? Because I foresee a time when we are not going to be able to find that excess capacity available to our north, and that time coming fairly soon.
Yeah, it's a fair noted point. I think there's probably a much more nuanced and longer answer on how we're considering the various import flows and interdependencies and simultaneous import limits and the RA construct itself between the two Illinois zones, the two broader RTO markets. But the short answer is we are certainly very aware and clued into the various constraints and realities of system operations between the two market scenes today, which cross the state, and what those could imply for downstream needs. Certainly it's an interesting situation when the PJM market is shorter than the MISO market as a whole, and yet there's also local transmission and power flow considerations as well. So it's well noted. I don't have a full scale response now to take up more time, but I think it's certainly something that we are aware of and taking into account as best we can within this modeling horizon.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the response.
Perfect. Thanks, Matthew. All right, we'll get to one more hand raised, and then Philip will get to you. But Alex, Stack Energy Consulting, go ahead.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for letting me ask a second question here. I'm curious where load management programs fit into this framework, whether that's getting incorporated into the ELCC modeling, or whether it's getting incorporated into the load forecasting process. And I'm thinking about both traditional kind of demand response style programs as well as integration of other types of distributed resources like net metering projects, net metering solar, net metering storage. I'm curious how those are getting factored in and whether those are getting factored in kind of as part of the load forecasting piece of it, or as part of the ELCC portfolio piece of it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll go give specific answer. We are certainly incorporating the expected reliability contributions from rooftop solar and distributed solar, as well as front of meter solar. The resources are broadly similar, but fixed tilt solar, like on rooftops, has a lower capacity factor. So it has a similar ELCC to front of meter solar that would be single axis tracking, but it is less, right? And so from a system perspective, we're talking about resource adequacy. So we're considering those contributions. And we have a projection of behind the meter solar programs that are assumed to be supported over the horizon and common across scenarios. And we count the ELCC contribution of those resources to those portfolios so that is a consistent under the methodological framework for RA analysis. Similarly, for batteries, we have the LCCs, and the LCCs are interactive to the amount of solar on the system, and that is also complementary. So we're thinking and tracking about those contributions as part of the ELCC and supply stack mix to serve total system needs. On the demand response question, demand response certainly can be part of a balanced diet in terms of a resource adequacy mix. And we are considering demand response as a resource in various ways in the study process across the scenarios, is the short version. Demand response, you have to assume certain things around any demand response, which is you assume a certain duration of events, a certain number of events that demand response program participants would participate in, and that, will somewhat contain the amount of total contribution, because obviously load shed is a perfect ELCC resource. So demand response is going to be, do you have 4-hour windows that everyone is responding to? And then, what does that 4-hour window look like compared to various modeled system conditions? And it can, in many ways, look a lot like a 4-hour battery. And you have to consider whether it's a shed load or a shift load. All of those things are being considered by our team as we think about the role of demand response in the portfolio mix and how that is being analyzed within this IRP cycle, knowing that there's still going to be, a lot of downstream studies most likely to consider the additional nuances and implementation pathways for load flexibility.
That's helpful. Can I just confirm so I make sure that I understood what you said so I can say it back and then you give me so the behind the meter and community solar forecast is something fixed, or maybe you run a certain number of sensitivities on it looking out into the future, and then the storage, both front of the meter as well as behind the meter, and the demand response are part of the portfolio mix optimization. Is that what you're saying?
The batteries are being selected. So yeah, behind the meter solar is a fixed trajectory, which is assumed to be supported by state programs over the future, and that is going to be consistent across scenarios. The front of meter solar and wind and batteries, alongside all other resources, are being optimized by the portfolio. We are not specifically optimizing behind the meter storage. We are letting the portfolio build front of meter storage, but we look at and think about the contribution of behind the meter storage in a similar manner to front of meter storage when it comes to the system bulk needs of resource adequacy.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Nate. All right, we'll transition to a couple of chat questions and then we'll go back to live questions. So the next chat question that we had was from Scott Bernstein on slide 7. In the October study, you stated that we cannot rule out the possibility of rolling blackouts in Illinois between now and 2030. You also estimated an effective reserve margin for ComEd of 8%. Do the analytical changes you just highlighted change either of those statements? So the reserve margins are calculated using our loss of load probability model as the reserve margins required for the system to achieve that loss of load expectation of 1 day in 10 years. The reliability of any system is best expressed as a risk metric. If the grid's not meeting the reliability target, such as the PJM system, based on recent forward auction results falling below the reliability target, that indicates that the risk of the loss of load events is higher than the target risk level, 1 day in 10 years. But by itself, it does not provide a measure of how much higher the risk is without quantification using a probabilistic model for that year. We had a couple questions on slide 8, so we'll try to answer these together. So Brett from Advanced Energy United and then Chelsea from Energy Futures Group, basically just having questions about industry forecasts being utilized from the high data center case, and then defining those under construction, and then if there's any announcements as well. So we'll go ahead and take those questions together. So the data sources used to inform data center scenario assumptions include utilities, RTOs, the Jones-Lang LaSalle, CBRE, EPRI, and data center map. Also the under construction projects have broken ground on the physical construction, while planned facilities have made announcements. We don't have insight into which of these projects are in communication with utilities for interconnection. And so to further talk about the data center map, for example, the data center map data set classifies data centers in operational, under construction, planned, and land banked. Operational are currently in service, planned are assumed to be completed in the next 1 to 2 years, and planned/land banked are assumed to be completed in the next 3 to 6 years. And then under construction projects have broken ground on physical construction, while planned facilities have made announcements. So I hope that answered both of those questions. And then we'll go on to another question for slide 8 in regards to data centers from Robert Stevens. Are any data center loads modeled as interruptible, curtailable, self-supplied, or otherwise flexible, or are all treated as firm native load? So data center loads are not modeled as curtailable or interruptible. Some of those data centers may self-supply or be off-grid or partially off-grid or entirely with contracted resources on the grid. So the IRP modeling approach assumes that the data center loads are all on grid and then solves for those resource portfolios to meet those loads in aggregate at the system level. Perfect. All right. And we have a few
Rochelle,
more
I
hands
just want to
raised.
chime in additionally
ahead.
on that point because I know this is a big one. While we are not modeling data center load flexibility in the load input, we are considering it in the total portfolio, needs. So that's we're not just assuming that data centers can't be flexible or that they would not pay other customers to be flexible. We know that flexibility could be a big factor in future system needs and how those needs are met. It's that you don't want to make an assumption that those loads are going to be flexible when you're not certain that they are or how they're going to be. So it's about a model paradigm where you want the load input to be the load input, and then the responsiveness of that load is more of a supply side consideration. It's a demand side, but it is a supply resource when you think about how the entire system solves for the reliability need. So just wanted to add that additional color commentary.
Thanks, Nate. We have a few more. I just want to get through a few more chat questions because I know that we were feverishly answering or asking some questions in the chat, and then we'll go back to the live questions. Apologies. So next question was from Deborah Williams on slide 10. Can you explain why such a big difference in EV base case between RA study and the IRP? So the IRP base case scenario currently reflects existing market trends. The ICC-led decarbonization pathways study will explore those pathways to achieving economy-wide goals in more detail. The electrification scenario in the IRP is drawn from the decarbonization study and reflects higher EV adoption. Next one from Chelsea in the Energy Futures Group. On slide 15, can you provide more information on the lower forecast for ComEd compared to the 2025 RA study? For example, does this mean projects have dropped out of ComEd's load queue since the 2025 RA study, or that projects have modified their load requests and that results in a lower forecast? So the 2025 RA study used load forecasts from ComEd and Ameren directly without adjustment from outside or other sources. The database of announced data center projects used to inform those data center load trajectories from the IRP cases showed that the ComEd data center forecast is larger than the entire current queue of announced projects, while the Ameren forecasts are much lower than the entire queue of announced projects. So we do have the data center map information as well. And then they use the, like we noted before, data center map with analysis performed by E3. All right, and then we'll do a couple more chat questions. I think from Brett Sproul, Advanced Energy United. I believe, Kevin, you wanted to answer this question live, but on slides 20 to 22, what is the specific goal of running the reliability model prior to the portfolio model, i.e. in other IRPs that I have seen, the reliability model and portfolio model can work concurrently, or portfolio model before the reliability model to develop a preferred portfolio that passes the reliability model. And Kevin, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rochelle, and appreciate the question. So we run the reliability model prior to the portfolio model to ensure that the portfolio model in its decision making is taking into account the reliability contributions of each resource. So in other words, we want that least cost portfolio of resources to be informed by the policy constraints, meeting load growth, and meeting those resource adequacy constraints. And so we need those resource adequacy contributions, or those ELCCs, as inputs to the portfolio model to ensure that those portfolios are both cost effective and reliable. We also leverage the reliability model and the portfolio model in tandem because it allows us to capture the full distribution and complexity of resource adequacy challenges across a really broad range of weather conditions. And so again, we're modeling 35 years of different weather conditions within our reliability model, as well as 20 different permutations of probabilistic conditions. And that allows us to get a really complex and complete picture of the reliability contributions of different resources and then feed that in as an input into our portfolio modeling framework.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. All right, we'll run into a couple more questions and then we'll go back to the live and then switch back to chat. Emily from the Clean Grid Alliance on slide 23, with respect to the recap model topology, does modeling each zone independently mean each zone is modeled as an island in addition to being modeled as part of the PJM and MISO footprints? ComEd and LRZ4 zones are modeled independently to ensure that they are sufficiently reliable. The capacity emergency transfer limit between ComEd and the rest of PJM and the zonal import ability between LRZ4 and the rest of MISO are accounted for in that model. And then the next question was from Scott Bernstein. I believe Kevin just answered this with his live answer. You're asking about the 35-year period ending with 2024. Weather appears to be changing. How will you account for potential fundamental changes? 35 weather years are modeled to capture a wide range of weather conditions, cold snaps, heat waves, such as those, and then are generally consistent with RTO methodology and assumptions. We also use temperature forecasts from the global circulation models, are highly SSP, RCP scenario specific and model specific, and are highly uncertain. But this IRP is being developed in a relatively short amount of time, but future IRPs may study this question in more detail. All right, and then we have a few more chat questions, but we'll run into the live questions quickly, and then we'll revert back to chat. So I think we have Philip from IIEC next.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Hey, Nate, I want to come back to something you said that actually really confused me. When you were talking about the flexibility of the data center loads being stagnant as a load, but then variable as a resource. I mean, doesn't that automatically force a higher resource requirement? I mean, shouldn't you treat them it seems to me you're treating the same resource differently on each side of the equation. Help me understand why that doesn't force a higher resource requirement.
Yeah, let me clarify. So, we think about demand response or flexibility in load, right, as part of a stack of resources that can meet the reliability requirements. So whether, the load either is going to happen on peak and need something else, or it's going to manage and not happen on peak. So those two things need to be, modeled consistently. It's valuable. We don't know for certain at all that data center load can or will be flexible, or exactly what kind of flexibility it will be, right? So when it's valuable to model data center load based on current operating data centers first, as a first stake in the ground, and then to say, okay, if this is what the load looks like, and you can choose from all this bag of resources, what resource mix serves this load alongside the rest of the system. And that's one data point that we're producing as part of the IRP, right? But then there's an important question of what if that load could be flexible? How would that change the rest of the resources that might get selected, right? So it's more of an if-then kind of scenario to look at that equation rather than to assume the data center load is flexible in a specific way and then only solve for that portfolio, right? Because we don't know that.
Gotcha. Okay, that was what you prompted with your. Let me go back now to my original question I had for you, which is, in looking at the ELCCs you got for solar and battery, et cetera, are those matched up with the forecast you're getting out of that PJM and MISO are producing, or are those derived from something else? And if you answered that before, I apologize.
Yeah, they are derived from E3's own loss of load probability model, which is called RECAP. That loss of load probability model is the same kind of model that MISO and PJM use to derive their ELCCs that they use for their own reliability planning and for their reliability capacity auctions. So in other words, we're using the same methodology, but we're using our own tool. The purpose of this engagement today, a workshop, was in part to illustrate to you all how we've calibrated that tool to show the same nature of loss of load risk that the RTOs themselves are producing. So we feel that it is a good representation of the same view of things, reliability risk, the nature of that risk, where the hours are, right, as both RTOs are producing. Now, that means that, when we have the same understanding of risk and the same understanding of generation and availability and weather conditions, which we generally do, we get numbers that are quite comparable. They're never going to be exactly the same number because there are certain very specific methodological differences in how the RTO numbers have been produced. You have to assume certain portfolios in the future. And there's also for the official ELCCs, without going into this a lot here, used by MISO and PJM for their capacity auctions are, MISO has a seasonal ELCC construct, PJM has a single annual number. The way they calculate those are more marginal reliability contributions, which are a little bit of a different measure than the ELCC that you would want to put into a portfolio optimization model. There's a whole can of worms in terms of the technical reasons why those are a little bit different and how they are different. And we'll do our best to explain those at a high level, why we did what we did in the IRP report. But suffice to say that we are seeing, very comparable results in terms of what we estimate the contributions of solar, batteries, wind to be to the system as a whole as both RTOs.
I would only ask that when you do the report, you highlight, hey, our ELCC for solar in 2030 MISO is X, MISO's is Y, just to make it an easy comparison. And I appreciate the time, Nate, as always. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Philip. All right, one last hand raised, and then we'll get to chat questions. Scott, joint solar parties.
I like Philip's suggestion. Thanks for that. Thank you, Nate, for all of the explanation about ELCCs and interaction of solar and storage. This feels like maybe a silly question, but is there a difference in how the ELCC value shows up when you're modeling the interaction of solar and storage across the system versus modeling a solar paired with storage resource at a single site? And maybe there's no difference from the model's 30,000-foot view, but I hope that question makes sense.
No, totally makes sense. And I just want to note that the reason we're talking with you all is, we have a lot of work to do under a very short time frame. We want to bring you all on board with us and answer your questions. So there are no silly questions here. That's the whole point. And that was a very fine question. So what about this like hybrid or co-location of solar and storage? From a portfolio from the planning problem we're trying to solve, there's no real difference between in terms of what the model sees or how we consider a co-location of solar and storage versus solar over here and storage over here. Now, that is a simplified answer, of course, right? But that's because we are solving for resource adequacy at a bulk transmission level by large aggregated zones, right? Like that is sort of this level of specificity that we're going for here. Now, in reality, there may be very specific site limitations where, if solar is over here and batteries are over here, and there's a transmission limit that's binding that doesn't let the battery charge when it would need to, or doesn't let the solar produce fully when it would need to, then that would be a reason why solar and storage on a single site behind a single point of interconnect might look a little bit different than those two separate resources, right? But in general, when we think about the contribution of solar is going to generate when it generates and it's delivered to the bulk transmission network according to its gen profile, the load is at its load profile, and a battery is able to charge when it needs to from any resource, whether it's solar or something else, a discharge. That's the kind of math that we're doing here. So we're considering those interactive effects as if, sort of agnostic between whether they're co-located or separate, because we are not trying to presuppose a very specific transmission constraint at a site level. We're taking a much larger kind of regional or really transmission zonal view of things.
Great. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott. Perfect. Thanks, Nate. All right, we'll run into the rest of the chat questions. If we get some hands raised, we can definitely transition to that, but we'll run through a couple of chat questions that haven't been answered yet. But start with Robert Stevens on slide 23. How does recap model correlate winter forced outages, gas supply constraints, and common mode failures during extreme cold events? Are those represented only through temperature correlated outage rates, or are fuel security and generator performance constraints modeled separately? So E3 models correlated winter forced outages by assigning a probability of outages based on those weather conditions. If there is lower temperatures, then the fleet will have a larger likelihood of an outage, which captures some correlated risk. That correlation combines the likelihood of outages, fuel security, and generator performance constraints. Scott Bernstein, will the updated resource adequacy estimate and the mitigation plan model the contribution of enhanced energy efficiency, and enhanced demand-side management. We'll be considering the potential reliability contributions of demand response and flexible loads in the IRP modeling exercise, but energy efficiency is included on the baseload forecasts for both Illinois zones. Aaron from Power Takeoff on slide 28. Regarding ELCCs, how do you account for staggered activation of different portions of the 4-hour BESS resource? So the recap simulates optimal storage operations whenever it's needed to minimize reliability risk, so it can spread the use of the storage fleet across any hours where it can avoid unserved energy. Robert Stevens on slides 30 and 31. How do the ELCC results on slides 30 and 31 compare to what you are seeing in other jurisdictions? So general trends are consistent with other jurisdictions. So as resource penetration increases in a given year, marginal ELCC decreases. Solar ELCCs are typically higher than wind at the same penetration in summer peaking systems. There are interactive effects between different resources, especially renewables and storage, which are also accounted for in the model. Thomas on slide 31, does the MISO ELCC take into account the seasonal construct? The ELCCs on slide 31 are used for planning purposes for input into Plexos, which account for the most binding seasonal requirements in each year based on the needs of the system. DLOL calculation by season for illustration will be included in the IRP report. I'll run through the last couple questions. Chelsea from Energy Futures Group, will the ELCC curves shown in these slides be what is modeled across all of the IRP scenarios? E3 calculates those unique ELCCs for each load scenario. Jamie Hall, could you share the thermal resource ELCC curves or capacity accreditation values from recap for all 4 modeled regions, including how they vary by technology and over time? So thermal ELCCs are being calculated with a consistent methodology accounting for forced outage risk. Detailed results will also be included in the IRP report. And Regina McCormick on slide 27, did you say you model adding resources on an hourly basis? The portfolio modeling is selecting new resources on an annual basis, but these resource selections are directly informed by system needs and energy values from underlying hourly load and dispatch simulations. Jason Hoke from Forum Energy, could you clarify what resource portfolio mix you assumed in the ELCC scenario inputs and what year of load you used when calculating ELCCs? So ELCCs are calculated by year. They also reflect the load and expected portfolio in that year to account for interactive effects. We had a couple of duplicate questions, and then Isaac Dua for ELCC, my understanding is that PJM applies the same asset class ELCC values across the entire RTO, with only individual resource level adjustments used to reflect asset-specific performance. Your results appear to show different ELCCs for asset classes between the zone and the rest of the RTO. Can you explain the analytical rationale for using separate zonal and rest of RTO ELCC values for the same asset classes, and whether that approach reflects locational reliability constraints, transmission deliverability limits, resource mix differences, or another modeling assumption? So we do so to ensure that the model is selecting least cost portfolios of resources to meet resource adequacy standards in each area over the long term. For example, we effectively this approach kind of ensures that our framework is robust enough, even if those zones become import constrained later on in the modeling period. We have 10 minutes left. I tried to jam through all of the chat questions, so if there are any other ones, please feel free to include them, but we'll go ahead and move back to Scott from Joint Solar Parties, and then we'll take a couple live questions, and if there's any other questions in the chat, we can have those as well. So go ahead, Scott.
Thanks. In one of the earlier workshops and round of comments, we discussed an archetypal VPP, and I wondered, do you need to assign an ELCC value to the archetypal VPP, or is its capability basically built into the assumptions of the VPP? And if so, does the carrying capability of a VPP decline over time, or excuse me, not over time, but as you add more VPPs, does the incremental carrying capability decrease as it does for other renewable resources?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I just wanted to circle back to this and frame that a virtual power plant, of course, as we discussed last time, is not any one resource. It is a mechanism, right, to compensate resources for performance, right? And specifically, it's more designed to be a compensation mechanism for resource performance on the demand side, whether that is customer-sited generation or storage of some kind, or load flexibility at the customer site, right? So that means that inherently the VPP cannot have a single ELCC because it is really just a mechanism, and the actual contributions of each of those components are driven by the components themselves and the interactive effects of those components with the rest of the system. So in other words, what that means is we don't need to have a separate VPP ELCC for rooftop solar because rooftop solar has its own ELCC based on its generation profile. It generates when it generates, that interacts with load as it interacts with load, and we're capturing that in the model contributions. Same with storage. Storage has, certain characteristics. It can charge and it can discharge and has a certain duration attached to it. That fundamental property is being accounted for in the storage ELCCs and the interaction with solar. So we don't see the need to model that separately to have a VPP resource representation. Again, sort of mechanism, not a resource. So instead, what we're doing, the succinct way to say it is we're looking at the underlying components of those resources and tracking those contributions rather than trying to define a representative singular portfolio that might fall under a VPP umbrella.
Perfect. Thanks, Nate. Anything else that I missed? Oh, there was one. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Rochelle, I can cover the question from Robert Stevens in the chat. Yeah, so thanks for the question. I did try to address this earlier in that we will be developing ELCCs for each of our different load scenarios over time. And so we will, through our reliability framework, be capturing the shift in reliability risk as a function of changes in both the magnitude and timing of load. So in our electrification case, we do expect building heating to shift more of the resource adequacy risk to the winter, which in turn impacts the reliability contributions of different resources, and that will be directly reflected in our ELCC framework.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. Couple more questions in the chat. Aaron from Power Takeoff. So is energy efficiency modeled in as a modifier to the baseline load, or is that input as a resource, talking about non-fuel switching EE?
Yeah, sure. So the short answer is it's modified. It's a modifier to the baseload resource. It's embedded in the baseload profile. Energy efficiency is not being modeled as a candidate resource because, as we all know and appreciate, it is not a homogeneous or monolithic resource. It is quite heterogeneous, right? Different energy efficiency measures have very different effects on, percentage of energy saved and the nature of that savings and the cost to achieve that savings. And within this time frame for the IRP, we simply do not have the time to sort of go through the full supply stack of potential energy efficiency measures and consider them in that particular manner. Instead, what we're doing is we are representing an expectation of continued energy efficiency based on current trajectories that are embedded in the baseload customer resource or baseload customer loads for each Illinois zone.
Perfect. Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah.
All right, we have 5 more minutes. We do want to close out, but are there any other Alex from Stack Energy, what other resource types are included in Plexos? Is there differentiation between thermal resources such as gas, oil, dual fuel, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I want to differentiate between resources that are online today versus candidate resources for portfolio selection. So we do represent the full range and nature of existing resources online today. That includes dual fuel oil-fired units, both inside and outside of Illinois, coal, gas, combined cycles, peakers, all that stuff. We've got those units all in the model as their contributions and mapped fuel types. We don't include each one of those for candidate resource to serve Illinois. We've simplified that down to the representative candidate resources that we talked about in the previous workshop. So essentially, we have short duration, batteries. We have long duration storage. We have a gas CT resource that is built outside of Illinois. We have candidate nuclear, and we have wind and solar. The full range of resource candidates, as well as the assumptions attached to them, will ultimately be in the IRP report and will be tagged for each scenario. So I won't go through an exhaustive list here, but the short answer is yes, we have a range of candidate resources that are allowed, for each scenario.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Alex. All right, we have one last question in the chat, and then I'll pass it to Jim for a wrap up. From Philip from IIEC. How does PJM backstop mechanism and MISO LMR requirement / program changes get factored into the analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short version is we are representing all of the latest developments in the market as they relate to expected resource additions and loads, right? And retirements. So in other words, we are taking, including the PJM reliability backstop procurement mechanism. That mechanism is designed to be a contracting vehicle for new megawatts. What matters for the sake of the model is the megawatts that are assumed to come online and the missing megawatts that PJM still needs that the model will solve for, right? So that's the level of detail that we are taking those into account and the way in which we're taking them into account. But the short answer is yes, we are tracking those developments and incorporating them as best we can within the assumptions of what is being built by the markets as is, what plants are retiring or not retiring as of the latest announcements. And then we will be locking down all those assumptions for the portfolios that will go into the report, knowing that all of this is always a moving target.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Philip. What we have on the screen, just to round this up for stakeholder feedback, is we do ask that you fill out the comment form if you have any comments, and you would have that available until August 14th. And then if you have any additional data or any kind of attachments that you want to send, you can send those directly to myself. My email is on the screen. And then just ask that you notate that it's workshop number 4, and then send those over to me via email. But then, Jim, do you want to close us out?
Rochelle, this is Ted Weaver. I have one more question. I'm on the phone though, so I wasn't able to raise my hand. Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So your guys are modeling 4 load scenarios, and this will be used back and forth with the pathway study. But the pathway, and to inform that and cost out the electric side of that, but the pathway study has 5 scenarios on its own, and each of those scenarios, will have a fixed amount of data centers and EVs, but 5 different levels of building electrification. So can you explain how the 4 scenarios you do here are going to be enough to support the pathway studies? Are you doing more runs that are specific to those pathway studies, or are you doing something else?
Yeah, I can chime in on that. It's a great question. The short version is that the pathway study has a specific objective, which is to study different, equivalent net zero scenarios, specifically around electric load versus use of the gas network over time, right? And so the study has crafted different electrification scenarios with that in mind, and the study is running, model results for those scenarios. For the IRP, we've taken one of those scenarios over to the IRP to study alongside the others, and that's the hybrid electrification case is what it's going to be called in the pathway study. And it's our electrification case for the IRP. It's called hybrid because it assumes a high trajectory of heat pump adoption in line with state targets, but it's also assuming that the gas distribution network is still online as a backup to those heat pumps during the coldest times, which already alleviates some of the peak heat or the peak power draw that would otherwise be required And so that's the scenario we selected from among the developed pathway scenarios to use in the IRP. The other scenarios in the IRP are designed to test lower or higher data center load adoption, which is really not the core scope of the pathway study, but is very relevant for the IRP. And so that's why we've defined these different load cases in this manner for the IRP.
Got it. So there's extra scenarios you're not showing here, but they will show up in the pathways.
That's right. Yeah. So we are not trying to talk
Thank
about
you.
all the pathway scenarios here because we took one of them to incorporate within the IRP.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks, Nate. All right, Jim, I'll pass it back to you for wrap up.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Rochelle. So first and foremost, I want to thank everyone for participating today. A few things in closing. One is, as you'll notice from the presentation that was posted online, there are additional materials in an appendix at the back. Please feel free to look through that as well. What I'll also say is that this presentation has been recorded. We are going to upload it. It takes about a day or so to render, so I would expect that maybe sometime on Monday or Tuesday morning. So please look back, and you can access that on the IPA's workshop webpage for this specific workshop. There's also a series of questions, so feel free again to look at those and respond accordingly as Rochelle's provided direction to do so. If you have any additional questions, even on submission, please reach out. We'll get back to you as soon as we can because your feedback's really important, especially at this stage when we're effectively into the modeling section of things in the drive to the November filing date for this plan. So there's a lot to do in a few months. We're trying to take everyone's thoughts and ideas into consideration as we drive to that deadline. Again, thanks for your participation in today's call and today's workshop, and we look forward to talking with you soon. Have a great day.